So there was a request to speak about women in the scriptures to gain a better understanding. Christelle, it's so nice. It's so late and you're not feeling well and your shoulder and you stayed up anyway for this.
I am good. Thank you.
I'm
Lots of
glad
ice.
your body allowed it. So we are going to speak about that. Now, obviously, there are many, many women in the scriptures. So I just picked a few that, you know, was very obvious to me of points that I thought were worth sharing. If there's more interest, people can let me know. I can do more. Obviously, there's many, many women. This is just a few. So starting from the top, the first woman in the scriptures, of course, is Eve, known in the Hebrew as Chava. So Chava is the first woman that we know of because she was the first woman. Now, just a little general understanding of, as they say, Adam and Eve, which in the Hebrew, Adam is Adam, so that sounds very similar. And in the English, it sounds very different, probably because Eve in Greek probably means the same thing, but I don't know Greek enough to tell that to you, but probably Chava. Chava is from the word life, because God named her as the mother of all living. Im kol chai. Chai are all that are alive. So from that word chai is her name Chava, the source, the mother of all life, because all mankind that has ever walked the face of the earth all come from Chava, all come from Eve. She is the primordial mother of every single human that's ever lived. Now, Adam and Chava have a very bad rap generally. Meaning people look at them and they're like, yeah, you know, they just couldn't control themselves. They didn't listen to God or whatever else people tell you. I don't know. It's not true at all. They were incredibly, incredibly holy people. They were the handiwork of God himself, so to speak, the prototype. Adam was the second holiest soul that ever lived. The only soul holier is that of Mashiach. Besides the Mashiach, the Redeemer, every single person's soul is not as great as Adam's. He was that holy, and obviously his wife was a piece of him, literally from his flesh. So Adam and Chava were incredibly holy people. And they were not hungry, that therefore they sinned and succumbed to sin because they were hungry. No, they were in a garden full of beautiful, beautiful, beautiful fruits. There was no hunger issue here. And they were not thinking like, oh my gosh, you know, I don't know, whatever you might have heard. They had plenty to eat, and they knew that the Sabbath was coming. The Sabbath was coming in exactly 3 hours. And once the Sabbath came, they knew they'd be allowed to eat from this tree. They weren't hungry. They knew in 3 hours they could do it. So what happened? There's many answers. There are many, many, many answers to that question. But just to put things in perspective. So one answer given, which I want to share with you to get a little inkling into Chava, is that she knew that in 3 hours the Sabbath was coming. And she knew when the Sabbath came, they'd be allowed to eat from the tree. And she knew that would in essence bring Mashiach. But she knew that the Mashiach that would come then would just be a Mashiach for the garden, for this hallowed land where they were on. That would be, so to speak, Mashiach. They're like, no, that's not good enough. Mashiach, the redemption, has to be the entire world. Meaning we can't just be in our little holy enclave, in our little holy area and make it godly. We've got to bring redemption for the entire world. So we got to get out of this garden, go into the world, and then transform the world and make the whole world God's garden. And that is one of the understandings of why she began this sin that led to them being kicked out of the garden, that led to everything else we've been experiencing in the last 5,781 years. So I just thought that was such a amazing vision for us, because this is our mother. This is my mother. This is your mother. This is every human's mother. Understanding, first of all, that absolute holiness, the absolute godly intent, And from this perspective, that absolute vision of redemption as reality, it was so real to her, redemption. It was so significant that it was worth the self-sacrifice of a sin, which is the most incredible self-sacrifice there is, to change not just her garden, but the whole world. Which also sort of evokes this concept that Chava, from the beginning, as the prototype woman, was other-centered. Other here didn't mean other people. The only people were herself and Adam. They were both safely in the garden. But she was other-centered. There's a world out there. And the world has to all become God's garden. And that's also, that's in our blood, that's in our genes, that's in the genes of every single human. I imagine, especially every single woman, that we're really coming from her. That by nature, if we get into the deepest part of our nature, we do care. We do care not just about ourselves and think of ourselves, think of our spouse, think of our family. We have a global feeling for the world. We have a feeling of global responsibility for the world. And this need to transform the entire world. Not just I should be safe, I should be kosher, I should be connected to God. There's a world that needs to be connected to God. And we have that responsibility in our blood. We get it from Chava. Because that's how she operated, and that's trickled down to every single person since. Obviously, some people use it, and some people ignore it, and some people aren't in touch with that. But it's in every single one of us. She's Chava. She's Aim Kol Chai. She's the mother of all life. So that's the first woman we see. Any questions or thoughts on that before we jump to the next one?
Is there any truth to the tale about Lila being the first woman?
So that concept,
And I might not be saying it right.
yeah, I know that we're talking to. Yeah, I guess in English say Lillian. That's not she was, any reference there is to her is not human. So no, she would be a force, and as it's understood, it was a negative force. It wasn't a godly force. It wasn't. I mean, obviously, everything is godliness because nothing's not godly. My pen's godly. If my pen wasn't godly, it wouldn't exist. The only fabric of creation is godliness. So every energy is godly. So that was the correct way to say it. What I mean is, as God structured his world, there are spiritual forces trying to bring us closer to God. And there are spiritual forces whose job it is, whose mission it is to pull us away from God. Inside every Jew, there's something called an evil inclination. The evil inclination is an angel. An angel. An angel whose mission it is to tempt me to stray from God. Now, why would God create angels to put them into people to get them to tempt us away from God? Because that's his system. The system is he wants us to choose to serve him. He wants the service to be real. He wants the service to come from a true, deep choice. So the only way I can deeply choose when this whole world is God is because there's a force inside of me pulling me in the other direction. And I've got to overcome that force and choose God. It's sort of like the vision, I sometimes think of it is a swimmer who's training for competitions. The swimmer will swim with weights. Now weights are weighing them down, making it much harder to swim. So they're going slower. It's much more difficult. But as they keep on swimming with those weights, training for their meet, their competition, when they take the weights off, they can fly past that water because they became so strong because they needed to be that strong to overcome the weights. So that's like a parable, a simple parable for the idea of why God would create forces. They're all from God's energy. It's like, this is not Christianity. There's no two sides. There's only one side. It's all God. There's no other version of the story. There's no other power. Everything godly, as we would call godly, and everything that we would call evil, all comes from God. It's the only force there is. So why would God create evil? Why would God create an angel whose job it is to tempt me to sin? So that I overcome that temptation and grow so much stronger and so much closer through overcoming the temptation. So that idea of Lilith or Lila, or whoever you've heard the reference, is in essence that concept. So not human at all. No source I've ever seen that there's any concept of human. And no, the first woman is Chava, Aim Kol Chai, mother of all life, created from the very flesh of Adam. From his flesh, the first man, came Chava, the first woman. Any other questions? Becca?
Okay, so I'm trying to wrap my brain around this because growing up, I was taught about the story that, of course, that force came in and is telling Eve or Hava that God's holding something back from you. He doesn't want you to eat this because he doesn't want you to be like him, you know, which was, I mean,
Sure.
I only recently learned that, well, they were already like him. They were in his image, you know, so, but that's okay. So that's what I was taught. And they were guilty of not trusting God, you know, and, you know, listening to this temptation, which we all do sometimes. But so, yeah, from that, you know, I grew up thinking, okay, it's all their fault, you know, because of them, now we're all sunk
Messed
in
up.
this. Yeah, we're all in this mess now, and we all have this tendency to give in to temptation because they did, you know, and everything. So it wasn't the case then that he was saying, God's holding
I'm
back
not
from
gonna
you.
say that. There are many, the he here, what you're talking about, the snake. The snake,
Yes.
okay, so the snake, prior
Mhm.
to the primordial sin,
Mhm.
there was no internalized evil, meaning Adam and Chava were completely white. Everything in this world was
Okay.
completely white. White meaning holy and pure and godly. The only other thing in this world besides white was the snake. And the snake was completely black. So the snake was the embodiment of evil. It wasn't a snake like you see slithering on the ground, but it had legs and somehow could communicate with man. No, it was the embodiment of evil with definitely many, many levels. And again, there are countless commentators on the snake's vision and what it was doing this for, of doing this. There are also many commentaries on Chava, her motives, Adam, his motives. You know, there's lots and layers of what's going on there. So I wouldn't say what you were taught was totally wrong. I would say it is an understanding of the most simplistic version, but there's layers and layers and layers going on underneath that. Just like, let's say I'm giving a little story. I don't know if it's gonna help, but just to bring up this point, let's say suddenly somebody walks in my door like, oh my gosh, like my sister-in-law who never comes, and oh my gosh, I don't want her to see this mess. So I say to my older child, assuming I have an older child in the house, oh, I see that your aunt just walked in. What I'm telling her is quickly clean up everything, throw it all in a room and close the door. But I'm not saying that. I'm saying, oh, I see guest walked in. But she understands, she's old enough to understand my code language. So if somebody was describing this incident, one person could say, when this guest walked in, I graciously said, oh, I see there's guests. Another person describing this incident could say, when this guest walked in, I froze, panicked, and had my kids quickly clean everything up while I distracted her. Which is true? They're both true. So there's layers that go on. That's obviously a very, very simplistic story just to bring out the point. And that's how it is in Torah. Now, in all of the scriptures, in all of Torah, there's myriads and myriads of levels of understanding, all of which work together. There's no such thing as two versions that are incompatible, because that doesn't make sense. If they happen, they have to compatibly happen. Compatibly, I said, oh, there's guests, and quick, clean up the mess. Both happened. They were compatible. So too here, when we're looking and saying, well, was the snake trying to tempt Chava? Absolutely. Did Chava succumb to his temptations? Absolutely. That is a true sentence. At the same time, that doesn't take away that the reason she succumbed could have been far, far deeper than anything people understood from just looking at the surface storyline.
Okay.
Originally,
I get
they
it.
were white. The snake was black. When they ate, what happened is suddenly almost everything in the world became a shade of gray. Meaning they weren't like us. They were completely white. They didn't have any evil inside of them. Chava and Adam had no internalized evil. They had no evil inclination. They had no voice tempting them to sin. It was this external force, the snake. It wasn't anything inside. Once they ate, mankind changed. We are all a product of that. So we all changed. How did we change? That evil became a part of us. Not perhaps as black as the snake was, but I'm not white. I've got grays. I've got pieces of me that are white, pieces of me that are a little darker than that. I've got to overcome it. Now, did they mess up God's plans? Not at all. This was part of God's plans. That's why it says that on a certain level, there's a verse that says, well, I'm not going to that's a whole other concept, but at a certain level, you could view this as a cosmic setup. Meaning they made free choices, but their free choices, certain things happened to make them make the choices they made because this is what God wanted to happen. And the same is true every time any of us mess up also. God runs the world. He absolutely runs the world. He runs every aspect of the world. That doesn't take away the fact that I'm making free choices. I make free choices all day long, hopefully good and probably sometimes not as good. We all make choices all day long. But my choice can never derail God's plans. So even though I'm making choices, you can say, well, I'm not Eve, true. But every single human being is a mover and shaker in the world. Every human being is changing reality. There's a beautiful thought of the Rebbe I was learning today, the Lubavitcher Rebbe, where he was explaining, there's a certain concept, a deep Hasidic concept, Kabbalistic concept, that the world is constantly being recreated every second. Every second, God revivifies all of creation. Okay, that's a Kabbalistic truth. The Rebbe explained on this that why? It's true. We know it's true, and it's not an innovation of the Rebbe at all. But why? Why did God set it up this way? Why didn't he just put some big force into motion? So at least for the next day or 100 years, everything's sort of run. Why does he have to each second revivify all of creation? And the answer the Rebbe gave is because that gives every second, everything the opportunity to reveal God. Because there's a new force of God inside of me this second that I can utilize and serve him with. So if God vivified me a year ago or a day ago, once I use that energy to serve him, well, I'm done. For the rest of the day or the rest of the year or the rest of the lifetime, I did it. Now what? No, there's always a new opportunity because every second there's a new energy of God inside of you that you have the opportunity to utilize and serve him with. So I'm not Eve, but every second God is giving me new energy, and every second God is giving everyone here new energy, and every second God is giving my cell phone new energy, because every second there's a new opportunity to utilize that energy and make a difference for God. So cell phones have no free choice, but man does in the arena of serving God, only in the arena of serving God. Outside of the arena of serving God, none of us have free choice, but in the arena of serving God, we all have free choice. So every time I make the correct choice, I change everything for the good. If I make an inappropriate choice, I harmed everything. But my inappropriate choice can never upend God's plans. So me making my free choices and God planning everything, we're always in sync. And the reason why I'm explaining that concept is similarly here with this primordial sin, Adam and Chava made choices, made free choices, made choices from a very, very holy place. But their choice which was of course ultimately a sin, a wrong choice, was not going against God's plan. It was moving God's plan exactly where he wanted it to be. But very often, going back to Becca's question, very often, if we would just read the surface storyline of Torah, we get a very distorted, warped vision of a lot of things. So it's not the fault. I wouldn't fault anyone that read the storyline and then understood it as such. But within understanding the Torah, there's so many layers and deeper layers and deeper layers and deeper layers, which if you think about it, makes so much more sense, but are all there. Like a simple example, we could use this week's Torah portion. Last week's Torah portion was Shalach, with the spies that Moses sent, the 12 spies, and 10 of them messed up. And basically because of them, the Jews were stuck in the desert for another 39 some years. Well, why did they do that? Oh, I don't know. They're really bad people. Were they really bad people? I mean, Moses hand selected them. There were 3 million Jews. There were 600,000 Jewish men between the ages of 20 and 60 he could have chosen. He chose 12 people from 600,000. He chose very carefully. He knew the dangers of the mission. He was very cautious about it. He was very dubious to do it or not. He consulted with God. So obviously he chose well, and he chose very righteous people, as he did. They were, it says clearly in the verses, they were the leaders of the Jewish people. They're very righteous. They're very holy. Every single one of those is very holy. So what happened? So there's many different things I could tell you. Just one idea, just to understand the point I'm trying to make, a very a basic explanation as explained in the writings of Hasidic thought, is that since they were so holy, they came into Israel and they're like, no way. We're going to come into this land and become a nation of peasants? We're going to become a nation of farmers? No way. Right now we're in the desert. Life is amazing. What do we do all day? We study God's word. Do we have to work? No. Do we have any physical needs? No. We got water from a rock. We get the manna from heaven. Our children are born with clothes. The clouds wash them, iron them for us. Our whole occupation is to study about God. We're going to go now and become peasants and become farmers. We're going to become so, of course, we become so materialistic, like, oh, that's horrible. Let's stay in the desert and serve God properly. Beautiful idea. Problem is, that's not God's will. God's will is you go into the land and you become farmers and you serve me as farmers. So, but I'm just saying, I'm not going to go into the whole concept of their understanding and their misunderstanding and their mistake. And it was a grievous sin. It was a complete sin. They were completely wrong. And there's many layers on how such holy people came to make a mistake. But again, I'm not trying to teach that portion. I just want to explain the concept. So if someone would say, oh, they heard about the story, they were spies and they really messed up, and because of them, the Jews were stuck in the desert. True, true, true. But I want you to understand, they were very holy people and they have very holy thoughts. They were wrong. But the wrong doesn't take away the holiness and purity of their motives. So that was what I was trying to bring in. Any questions? Yeah. Any questions? Okay. So that was Chava. The next woman I picked, just because I thought it was sort of tied into the other topic, was Leah. Leah, of course, is one of the matriarchs. Sarah, Rivka, Rebecca, Rachel, Rachel, and Leah. Now, what was Leah's story? Leah's story is she cried. She was a real crier. She cried for years. When the verse describes her, it speaks about how beautiful Rachel was, and how Leah's eyes were so soft, so red from years and years of crying. She was not beautiful because her eyes, she would have been beautiful, except her eyes were so soft, reddened from years and years and years of crying. So why was she crying for years? Because she was praying for years to God. What was she praying about? Well, she was told from when she was a young child. Everyone spoke. Everybody, knows how to talk. That's not a modern phenomenon. Everybody, you can send messages without WhatsApps or texts or anything. Social media doesn't have to exist in this form. So she always heard, oh, Rebecca has 2 boys. Her brother, Lavan, has 2 girls. It's going to be the older boy to the older girl, the younger boy to the younger girl. Everybody knew the scoop. Everyone knew the story. So when she was very young, she knew she was destined to be the wife of Esau. Esau for Leah, Jacob for Rachel, for Rachel. So Rachel, the younger sister, is going to get the younger brother, the holy, holy tzaddik, the godly, godly person, Jacob. And she's the older sister, Leah. She's going to get the older brother, the evil, evil, evil incarnate Esau. And she spent years praying to God to not have this fate. And the truth is, the people were right. On a certain spiritual level, she was destined to be the wife of Esau, but it didn't happen. In the end, she became the wife of Jacob, of Yaakov. And she became the mother of 6 out of the 12 tribes. Rachel got 2, Bilhah got 2, Zilpah got 2, and Leah got 6. So she didn't marry Esau, where there was a certain destiny for her to marry Esau. She married Jacob. And she was the mother of 6 of the 12 tribes because her prayers changed the decree. It was literally decreed, and literally her prayers changed the decree. And that is such an enormous lesson. I know we're going to speak about prayer not tonight, but I guess I was thinking about prayer as I was preparing this. And to me, it was such a powerful thought that we change decrees. Literally, our prayers make that difference. We should never feel sort of helpless, hopeless, which sort of an easy space to fall into. It's a space our evil inclinations like us to be in, because once we're helpless and hopeless, everything else falls apart, including our connection to God. We're super powerful. Look at Leah. There's this literal decree, and she literally changed it because she prayed. So whenever we're in a situation, we should always understand we have that recourse. We can always turn to God. We can always pray, and our prayers create realities. That's why they say that a prayer could be even more powerful than like a blessing of a holy person. Because when a holy person gives you a blessing, that can draw down good stuff that's up there and wasn't able to come down. But it can't change whatever's up there. But when someone prays, you can. Prayer can change what's written. That's the power of prayer. So we have that enormous, enormous power that we can always access by turning to God and praying. Any questions on that, or anything else related to Leah? Okay. So next I picked, trying to sort of go in order, the women in the desert, the women of Egypt. Because that's sort of a group, it's not an individual, but it's a very powerful group of women who the Arizal says is reincarnated in this generation, the generation bringing the redemption. The women in Egypt believed in God and in redemption in a way that the men didn't. We view the women as the catalyst of redemption. The sages say in the merit of the women, the people redeemed, the Jews were redeemed from Egypt. And we see this because a week after they left Egypt, of course, was the great fear and horror of the pursuit of the Egyptians beside them, the sea in front of them, and then God's enormous miracle of the splitting of the sea, one of the greatest miracles of all times. And after that miracle, both the men and women sang praises to God. Now, being modest and understanding God's will, they didn't sing together. That would be viewed as immodest. So the men had their song, led by Moses, and the women had their song led by Miriam. And the men's song is many verses long, and the women's song is like one verse. But we're told that the women's song was more pleasing to God than the men's. And there's 2 reasons given why. Like, what was different? The men are singing praise, the women are singing praise. They're both ecstatic. It was an unbelievable. I mean, here these Jews lived through the 10 plagues, but this was beyond that. So what was different about they're thanking God? So the answer is 2 things. One, it says the women didn't just sing, they had musical accompaniment. They had, usually it's understood as tambourines, it might be translated as drums. They had drums, perhaps, and definitely tambourines that were their musical accompaniment to their song. The men had no musical instruments. And it says the women not only sang, they danced. The men just sang. So there were two differences between the song of the men and the song of the women. The women had musical instruments, the men did not. The women danced, the men did not. Both of these explanations, and again, as I said before, explanations are compatible. They probably both dance and have musical instruments, obviously. So it's not a conflict understanding what was special about their song. Express the difference between the women and the men in terms of their relationship to God and their belief in the redemption. Like, why did the women have tambourines and the men didn't? Where were the men's musical instruments? And the answer is because the women so believed in redemption that even as they left Egypt, they said, we're not done yet. We're not done yet. This is not the end. We know we're going to ultimately experience the ultimate redemption, which means the complete destruction of Egypt. Right now we're leaving, but Egypt is still around. We're not done. And because we're not done, as we're going out with our knapsacks, ready with all the provisions we're going to take for our sojourning in the desert, we're going to find a spot for the tambourine. We're going to find a spot for that drum, because I know God's going to make miracles and I want to be ready to thank him. And the men didn't think like that. So they might have owned musical instruments, but they didn't think to bring them into the desert. And for the same reason explains why did the women dance and why did the men dance? You didn't have to be ready, you dance on the spot. Because the dance is like this full, whole body expression of the joy. The joy reached such a peak. It was so intense that it couldn't just be expressed by their mouth. That wasn't enough. It couldn't just be expressed by their hands with their tambourines and their drums. That wasn't enough. They had to literally dance to give expression to the enormity of joy they were feeling at that moment. Now, I'm not saying the men weren't absolutely over the top joyous, but it still wasn't the same as a woman's. And that's why they didn't feel a need to dance and the women did. So why was their joy greater? Because they more deeply felt the pain. The joy is as per the pain. Since they, as a group, the women, much more deeply felt the pain of the Egyptian exile, as a group, they much more deeply felt the joy, because to the degree of your pain is going to be the degree of your joy. The men had less pain, so they had less joy. They still had a lot of pain and a lot of joy, but the women had much more pain and much more joy. Well, why did the women have more pain? Because they're women, they feel things more deeply, but also because they had a deeper belief in the redemption. The leader of the women's name was Miriam, Moses' older sister, 6 years older. Miriam, not 6 years, 5 years older, 5.5. And she, as a child, had received a prophecy from God that a boy would be born to her mother who would be the Redeemer. That boy was Moses. And she had that prophecy when she was like 5 years old, sorry. And for her entire life, until she was about 86, and redemption happened, she was holding on to that prophecy. She was holding on to that belief in redemption. And because she believed so strongly, she conveyed this. She was the leader of the women. She conveyed this to all the women, this intense, intense belief. This is an aberration. We are getting out. This is not the real deal. This is not it. When I was a child, God gave me a prophecy that Moses was going to be born, and he was born. And he was born in the most miraculous way. And he was born, and the whole house was full of life. And he was born already circumcised. And he was in the palace. And it's true. He's the Redeemer. And he's coming. At this, of course, there were 40 years when Moses was missing in action. He is going to redeem us. It's absolutely true. And we have to stay strong. And because she had such a sense that the redemption was coming, the pain of the Egyptian persecution was much, much, much more intense. Meaning, if you are in a bad situation and you don't see any hope for change, and you don't ever expect it to get any better, you sort of get used to it, resign yourself to it. That's life. It's bad. It hurts, but that's life. But if you know life isn't supposed to be this way, you never resign yourself to it. And that's why the hurt is much deeper. When you really believe in redemption of whatever the issue is, the pain you're going through is much more intense because you know this is not how it's supposed to be. This is an aberration. It's supposed to be good, and this is not good. So their belief is deeper, which meant their pain was deeper, which meant their joy was deeper. And that's why they had the musical instruments, and that's why they had the dance. And we see this throughout, you know, the situations as the Jews continued in the desert. In all the situations, the women always emerge as the true believers, and the men sometimes mess up. I mean, they mess up, not every single man, because obviously the men that messed up generally died. But in general, the men messed up and the women did not. By the sin of the golden calf, not one woman sinned. By the sin of the spies, not one woman sinned. The women that left Egypt entered Israel. The men that left Egypt died in the desert, besides the tribe of Levi. So that is an innately feminine quality. This deeper belief, which could create sometimes deeper pain in the wrong and deeper joy in God's salvation. And so we all have that. We have that deeper belief, and that was given to us not just for ourselves and not for a sense of superiority, but to help the men around us, our husbands. It's a woman, and women. I assume I'm preaching to the choir. We all know this. Women generally have a more innate, deeper connection to God. I mean, your husbands might be more innately, deeply connected to God than you are, and that's fine, and that's amazing. But that's unusual. So, women in general have a deeper sense of God, a deeper belief in God, a deeper relationship with God. And it's not for us to feel superior. It's for us to share the wealth and help bring our husbands and our children and the world around us to this level of relationship.
That's a good point. Good point.
And any questions on any of that? Any thoughts on any of that? Any comments?
Just that I relate to Miriam in that way, that she was so strong in her belief. I gotta say, I've really rarely been a person to resign myself to anything. No, this is going to change one way or another. Either it changes this way and, you know, or it changes that way, but it's going to change.
And that's
so I relate to her that way.
Figure. I mean, there's much more I could say. I was just trying to touch on a few people, but Miriam was an enormous, our sages even say the Redeemer, this was Miriam. Normally, of course, we view Moshe as the Redeemer. But the sages say Miriam was the Redeemer for this reason, because she was so strong, so committed, so firm and resolute that she was able to inspire all the women this way. And therefore, we have a whole nation of women that are so strong in their conviction that therefore the redemption came and all the Jews got out, including all the men.
That's inspiring.
Doesn't mean the men were like, you know, all saying no, 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 no. But the women were coaxing them, leading them along, that they should also say yes, yes, yes. So yes, she was definitely an amazing woman, an amazing redeemer of 3 million people. And definitely, again, a woman we could look at as like, wow, that is the power of a woman. That is a woman's power.
Very inspiring.
Anyone else? Any other comments or questions or thoughts on any of this? I'm just going to do one more, because I thought this was like such an example for this class. Ruth. Now, Ruth, who you probably just know even from biblical awareness, Ruth was so special, and I thought it was so, like, to me, it was the most obvious choice to discuss tonight, because Ruth freely chose God. It made no sense for her to choose God. She was, as you might know the story, a Moabite princess. Now, again, I think princesses those days in life was a little different than princesses today, but she was a princess. So whatever worth it had, she was definitely a princess. She was from the royal family. Her father was the king of Moab, Eglon. Ruth had been married for 10 years to this Jewish man named Machlon. She was childless. They never had children in 10 years. When she married him, her husband was quite wealthy, which is why the king of Moab wanted his daughters, he had 2 daughters, to marry these 2 Jewish men that had come to live among them because they were so extremely wealthy. 10 years later, both men had lost everything. Just God's, turning to them to repent because of their wrongdoing and leaving Israel and leaving their brethren suffering by famine. So her husband, Machlon, dies penniless. So she, in a sense, is penniless because she has no money besides her husband. He's gone. At this point, what should she do? Go back home. She hadn't rebelled against her parents. I mean, they married her. She had no choice in the matter. She was married to this man for 10 years. He's dead. He has no money. She has no children. She has no strings attaching her to this situation at all. Go back home. Go to the palace. They'll find you a new husband. You'll get married. You'll have food on your table. God willing, you'll have children. And you'll have a husband. And you'll have a life. And she wasn't young at this point. She was already 40. So, time's ticking away. Now, originally, when the 2 men died, Machlon and Chilion, they had their 2 wives. Rus, who was married to Machlon, Arpa, who was married to Chilion. And both of them, of course, had gone through a certain conversion when the marriage started. So they were technically Jewish. But the question was, did they really accept it? Because again, as I said, they have no choice in the matter. These are princesses. This is a royal marriage. All marriages in those days, I'm sure, were arranged, but definitely royal marriages were arranged for centuries and centuries after. So this was just a royal marriage. So obviously, if the deal is they got to convert to Judaism, they converted. So did they really mean it? Did they really accept it? We don't know. For 10 years, they're officially Jewish. Follow the laws because that's their husband's laws, but now their husbands are gone. So at this moment, when the husbands died and their mother, Naomi, so she's alone stuck in Moab. Her husband is long dead. He died before the sons got married. So he's been dead over 10 years. The 2 sons are dead. All their money is gone. They were fabulously wealthy, and now they are literally penniless. And she's like, I'm going back. What am I doing stuck in Moab? It was never her choice in the first place. She was a very righteous woman. Her husband made the decision. So she's going back. Absolutely destitute, penniless, widow, embarrassing, degrading. She left as the richest person in the country. She's coming back as this absolute pauper, having done this wrong thing. And obviously God was telling them it was very wrong. And her 2 daughter-in-laws, Rus and Arpa, said, we're coming with you. We love you. We don't want you to, you're old and alone and poor. You can't do this. We'll stick with you. And she's like, don't be crazy. Don't do me any favors. You're both young enough. You're both princesses. Go back home. You have parents. They'll marry you off to someone else. You'll get married. You'll have a husband. You'll have children. You'll have a life. Don't come. You'll have nothing with me. You won't get married. You won't have kids. We have no means of support. Don't do this. She knew that there was almost no hope of them finding marriage in Judea, back in Israel, because in those days, there's a biblical verse that says a convert, a Moabite or an Ammonite, but meaning a convert, obviously not meaning a non-Jew, a Moabite or an Ammonite cannot enter the congregation of the Jewish people. Meaning you can always convert. Conversion is never closed to anyone, but they couldn't marry a Jew. They would have to marry probably another convert, which is rare, hard to find, especially in those days. Now, the verse actually does not mean Moabite and Ammonite women, because the reasoning for the verse is because when the Jews were in the desert, these men were so horrific to us. But the sages said, God can't mean the women. It wasn't the women's fault. The women aren't the ones that are supposed to be going out. So we don't blame them at all. The women were, as usual, blameless. The men were messed up. So God is talking about the men. So that was the traditional explanation on this verse. But most people didn't know that was the explanation because there weren't too many Moabite or Ammonite converts in those days because Moab and Ammon were the enemies of the Jewish people. So they didn't really produce converts. So the misunderstanding for most of the Jewish people was, oh, you can't marry a convert from Moab or Ammon. Not meaning you can't marry a male convert, but you can't marry a convert. So Naomi knew this. So Naomi's thinking, if they come back with me, no one's going to marry them. People are going to assume they're not allowed to marry them because they're from Moab. And they're penniless, so they've got nothing that'd be attracting anyone to marry them. And they're from the enemy Moab. That might also be a black mark against them, or not, depending on how people would look at it. I mean, they were converts, but still. So no one's going to want to marry them. So I'm taking these women. I mean, okay, she's alone and her children died and she's penniless, but like, I'm an old woman. These people are still young. They have a life ahead of them. This shouldn't happen to them. So she was telling them, go back home. Go back. Go back. They were converted, but since the conversion perhaps was on this condition, maybe they never really were Jewish in the first place, or maybe they were, who knows? If they stick with me, they were Jewish, but if they don't stick with me, they never were. So go back home and get married and have a life. And Orpah listened and went back home. And Ruth irrationally, completely irrationally, stuck with Naomi and stuck with God. Complete irration. Naomi was right. Logically, she didn't have to do it. She could have gone back and gotten married and had a family. And she said, I'm choosing you and I'm choosing God. I'll never have a husband. I'm choosing you and I'm choosing God. I won't have kids. From a princess, I'm going to become a beggar. I'm choosing you. I'm choosing God. And that's what happened. And I think that was such an example for this class, because everyone here makes choices and everyone here gave up a lot for God. And that's exactly Ruth. Ruth is considered the ultimate prototype convert. The woman, Ruth, not a man convert. There were many righteous men converts as well. She's not the only righteous convert. There are many, many righteous male converts, but she's the prototype convert. She truly suffered. They were so poor when Ruth and Naomi, her mother-in-law, came back to Israel. They were so poor that Ruth had to join the beggars to gather sheaves for them to survive. And she's a princess, you know. And she did this, and she didn't want her mother-in-law to be so degraded. She told her mother-in-law, you stay home, I'll do this for both of us. So she went through a lot, but ultimately she married the leader of the Jewish people, Boaz, and their child, Oved, was a great, great, great righteous tzaddik, an enormously godly person, and the grandfather of David. So the entire line of David, which is the entire line of Mashiach, dates back to Ruth. Ruth is marrying the leader of the Jewish people, Boaz. They have a son named Oved, very, very holy person. Oved means a servant. He was a true servant of God his entire life. He had a son named Yishai, who was such a holy person that the sages say he was one of the few people throughout the entire creation that truly only passed away because of the original primordial sin. There was nothing, not one trace of anything could be associated with him that would ever, anything on any level. He was so pure. And he had a son, David, the first redeemer of the Jews, so to speak, who had a son, Solomon, from whom comes all the lines of the kings of Israel, from whom comes the ultimate king, the Mashiach, the Redeemer. So the Redeemer, Mashiach, Solomon, David, Yishai, Oved, they all come from Ruth. Ruth sacrificed everything for God. She didn't know she was getting anything in return. She didn't think she'd ever get married. Naomi was like, don't come with me because it's not fair. Go home and get married. She never knew she'd get married. She never knew she'd have a child. She never should have any stability. She sacrificed it purely for God. And God paid her back to this enormous degree that she is the ancestor of Mashiach, of the ultimate Redeemer, of the ultimate Savior of the whole world. Which is just so clearly how God pays back for every single drop of sacrifice, for every single drop of suffering, for every good thing we ever do. God always repay. God will never be indebted to us. That's what God says. He says, I'm never going to be, you're never going to be the giver and I'm the recipient. I will always pay you back far more than you ever give me because I'm God. So Ruth had enormous sacrifice. and God had his plans. And she was paid back in the most amazing way possible. Literally the matriarch of Mashiach. So she's actually the ancestress of Lubavitch Rebbe, the ultimate Mashiach. The Rebbe, who is the seventh Rebbe, this Rebbe is like a Hasidic term for leader of Lubavitch. He is a direct descendant. I'm gonna give you a little bit of genealogy of Mashiach fast. The Rebbe is a direct descendant of the first Lubavitcher Rebbe, whose name is Rosh Zalman of Liadi. The first Lubavitcher Rebbe traces his lineage directly back to a very, very, very holy great Jew, who you might have heard of or might not have heard of, called the Maharal of Prague. If you ever heard of the Golem of Prague, he's the one that made it. He's a great sage, a great rabbi, a great Kabbalist. The Maharal of Prague traced his lineage all the way back for centuries to the last of what's called the Gaonim. His name was Reb Hai Gaon, the leader of the Jewish people in the Babylonian exile. And Reb Hai Gaon traced his lineage all the way back to Solomon, the son of David. Which means, could you imagine there's someone today, Lubavitcher Rebbe, who can have an unbroken chain, literally can list every single ancestor all the way back to David, which means all the way back to Rus. Unbroken lineage all the way back to Rus. So this was Rus. And I was really thinking of any woman that I wanted to shine the spotlight on. I wanted to shine the spotlight on her, because I think all of us can look at her and look at her sacrifice for God and the choices she made for God and the leaving, everything she had to leave, her family, her country, her friends, her culture, her language. She had to leave everything. She left everything for God. And I just thought that, to me, that so resonated, you know, everyone here in this class. Obviously, each of us are our own levels, but we all have that. And that's, we really can see from Rus that enormous energy there of giving it all up for God. Any questions or thoughts on that? Okay, so it is quite late, especially for people on the East Coast. You're still up, amazing. So we will stop at this point. And next week, we will discuss prayer, because that was the other topic. Someone asked for women and someone asked for, or more, I think a few people actually asked to speak about prayer. So we will do that. And if anyone has any other ideas of topics they would like, please forward them, either put them on our WhatsApp group. I can just see them directly, or you can forward them to Danielle, because definitely, of course, this class is about you. So I want to make sure it's exactly what everyone here would like to study. Have a wonderful week. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. Shavua Tov.